The last time I was with you, I was going over some climate experts' warning concerning a looming catastrophe. And I pointed out that all of these predictions that were made, none of them have come to pass. The first I gave was from December of 1939, where the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Sunday Courier had as a headline, "All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting." And then in May of 1947, we saw Dr. Hans Ullman, a Swedish geophysicist, said the possibility of a prodigious rise in the surface of the ocean with resultant widespread inundation arising from an Arctic climate phenomena. And of course, that has not happened. February of 1952, quote, "The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago." That was Dr. William Carlson, an Arctic expert. March of 1955, there are now 6 million square miles of ice in the Arctic. There was once 12 million square miles. That was Arctic explorer Admiral Don McMillan. This was stated in the Rochester, New York Democrat and Chronicle. October of 1958, some scientists estimate that polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in an area than half a century ago. And that was in 1958. They said that the Arctic ice sheet was only 7 feet thick, and as of 2023, the Arctic ice sheet is still 7 feet thick, 70 years later, 65 years later, still the same thickness. November of 1967, it's already too late for the world to avoid a long period of famine. That was 1967, some 55 years ago, no global famine. April of 1970, scientists predict a new ice age by the 21st century. We're now 23 years into the 21st century, and guess what? No ice age. October 1970, America will be rationing water by 1974, rationing food by 1980. None of that has happened. None of it has been needed. July 1971, quote, "The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age." Well, we are 50 years away from July of 1971, and there is no ice age. Now, when you demonstrate from history that these arguments that have been made that we're all going to die, the world is going to blow up, we're going to have a catastrophe, we have to do something now. We have to do something now. If we don't do something right now, then it's going to be too late. In January of 1972, quote, "We have 10 years to stop the catastrophe," said Maurice Strong, then United Nations Environmental Secretary, regarding the world's environmental problems. That was published in the Swedish newspaper Dagen Nyheter. Well, guess what? Here we are now, 51 years later. And what do I hear Alexandria Occasional Cortex say? 3 years ago, she said, "We have 10 years. We have 10 years. They were saying that 50 years ago. In fact, they were saying that 90 years ago. Guess what? Nothing has happened. December of 1972, two Brown University geologists wrote a letter to President Richard Nixon reporting that a conference attended by 42 top American and European investigators concluded a global deterioration of climate by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind is a very real possibility, and indeed may be due very soon. Well, what did they say? What did they say? The present rate of cooling, they said, seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century if continuing at the present pace. Within 20 years, Al Gore was saying global warming, global warming. Guess what? Neither an ice age or global warming has taken place. January 1974, space satellites show a new ice age coming fast. That was reported in The Guardian. June 1974, another ice age, Time magazine headline asked. January 1978, an international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indices of climate that there is no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years, at least in the northern hemisphere. A year later, in 1979, the same newspaper, the New York Times, was reporting exactly the opposite, that we are going into global warming and we will never survive the coming global warming. February 1979, there's a real possibility that some people now in their infancy will live to a time when the ice at the North Pole will have melted. A change that would cause swift and perhaps catastrophic changes in climate. That was a year later in the New York Times. May of 1982, Mustafa Tolba, then executive director of the UN Environmental Program, said that if the world didn't change course, it would face an environmental catastrophe which will witness devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust by the year 2000. We're 23 years beyond that, and guess what? No Holocaust. September of 1988, the small island nation of Maldives was threatened to be completely covered by, quote, a gradual rise in average sea level, end quote, in 30 years. Aegean France press reported, noting that the end of the Maldives and its people could come sooner if drinking water supplies dry up by 1992. During 2020, during the COVID catastrophe, the Maldives islands were still there and still attracting people that were going there to visit, tourists and other attractions. Now, what I'm trying to point out is this. God created the heavens and the earth. They're not the product of evolution. And God created the heavens and the earth and then sustained them by the word of His power. I'm not saying that we ought to be bad stewards of what God has given to us, the earth that God has given to us. Not at all. I'm not preaching waste. What I am preaching is that all of these climate doomsday prophets are all liars. Not one of their predictions has come to pass. Not one of their predictions has come to pass. Another thing I have observed in the 58 years that I've been alive, and I've been following environmentalism and environmental policy for more than 30 years. I became acquainted with this back in 1992 with the big environmental summit down in Brazil, and I've been following this very closely. And I'm not an evolutionist and I'm not an environmentalist, but I have observed that the element of society that quote unquote cares so much about the earth and the environment and the climate and things of that nature are among the most filthy people in society. They are some of the dirtiest and most unkept people in society. And in my observation, they are some of the greatest wasters in society. They do everything they preach to us against, they do. Now, if a prophet makes a prophecy and their prophecy doesn't come to pass, then at some point you and I are going to have to stand off to the side and say, that man's a liar. That woman doesn't know what they're talking about. Because they have been wrong every time they've opened their mouth. They have been wrong. Let's come up into the 21st century. March of 2000. Snowfalls are now just a thing of the past. The Independent wrote, quote, children just aren't going to know what snow is, said David Venner, a senior research scientist at the Climate Research Unit of England's University of East Anglia, noting that within a few years winter snowfall would become a very rare and exciting event. While snow is rare in southern England, it still comes pretty much every winter. December of 2001, the changes in climate could potentially extirpate the sugar maple industry in New England within 20 years, according to George Hurt, co-author of a 2001 global warming report commissioned by the U.S. Congress. Today, New England still produces plenty of maple syrup 22 years on. February 2004, The Guardian reported on a secret Pentagon report that predicted climate change will lead to nuclear war. Major European cities will sink into the ocean, and Britain will descend into Siberian climate by the year 2020. Here we are in 2023, and guess what? None of it has happened. January 2006, unless drastic measures to reduce greenhouse gases are taken within the next 10 years, the world will reach a point of no return. The Associated Press wrote, paraphrasing Al Gore, a prominent multi-millionaire global warming advocate. None of Al Gore's predictions have come to pass. Not one. He has become fabulously wealthy, but not one of his predictions has come to pass. Well, my time is gone on the Bright Spot Hour today. May the Lord richly bless you until our broadcast tomorrow.
South Carolina 29602. I'm Mark Ferguson reminding you to